Most people believe that if they just give a little more, love a little harder, show up a little stronger, they can finally break through an avoidance walls. But that belief, while well-intentioned, is fundamentally flawed because the avoidant does not experience pursuit the way you do. What feels like love to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like consistency to you can feel like suffocation to them. And so the more you lean in, the more they instinctively lean out. You have to understand the psychology at play here. Avoidants are not driven by connection in the same way. They are driven by the preservation of autonomy. At a deep level, they associate closeness with a loss of self. So when energy comes toward them too intensely, even if it's warm, even if it's genuine, their system interprets it as a threat. Not because you are a threat, but because their internal wiring has taught them that dependence equals danger. Now here's where the shift happens. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you interrupt that entire pattern. When you no longer flood the space with constant messages, constant reassurance, constant emotional availability, something unexpected occurs. You create silence. And in that silence, for the first time, they are not reacting, they are feeling. And what they begin to feel is not relief alone, but curiosity. Because human beings are wired to move toward what feels just slightly out of reach. When you are always there, always available, always giving, there is nothing for them to move toward. You've already closed the distance for them. But when you step back, not as a strategy, but as a genuine return to your own center, you reintroduce space. And space is where attraction breathes. This is not about playing games. This is about reclaiming your energy. There's a difference. When you chase, you abandon yourself in the hope of securing someone else. When you create space, you return to yourself and allow the other person the dignity of meeting you there. And here's the paradox. The less you try to pull them in, the more they begin to lean forward. Not because they've suddenly changed overnight, but because the dynamic has changed. You are no longer the source of pressure. You've become the source of possibility. They start to notice the absence of your constant presence. They start to question it. They start to feel something unfamiliar, a pull that is not coming from you, but from within themselves. And that's the only kind of movement that ever lasts. Because when an avoidant initiates from internal desire rather than external pressure, it's real. But this requires discipline, because there will be moments where your instinct tells you to reach out, to close the gap, to ease the uncertainty. And in those moments, you have to ask yourself, am I acting from strength or from fear? Because every time you override your own center to manage their response, you reinforce the very dynamic that keeps them distant. Space is not the absence of love. It is the environment where authentic connection becomes possible. It allows both people to show up by choice, not obligation. And for an avoidant, that distinction is everything. So if you want them to finally initiate, to finally take that step toward you, you have to stop taking all the steps for them. You have to trust that what is meant to move toward you will do so when you give it the room to move. And the truth is simple. When you stop chasing, you don't lose them. You give them the first real chance to find you. Let's go deeper into something most people completely misunderstand about avoidant dynamics. Emotional intensity is not what creates safety. It is what destroys it. Now that might sound counterintuitive if you've been taught that love means openness, expression, and emotional transparency at all times. And in healthy, secure dynamics, that is absolutely true. But when you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment structure, their nervous system processes emotional intensity very differently. It doesn't register as closeness. It registers as pressure. So when you are emotionally reactive, when you escalate, when you seek reassurance repeatedly, when you try to fix the distance through more communication, you are not creating connection. You are increasing internal threat perception in the other person. And here's the critical insight. They don't withdraw because they don't care. They withdraw because they care and feel overwhelmed by what that care demands of them. This is why emotional regulation becomes the real turning point. Because regulation is not about suppression. It is not about pretending you don't feel. It is about becoming someone whose feelings do not spill outward in a way that destabilizes the relational field. It is the difference between I feel something and I can hold it versus I feel something and I must immediately resolve it through you. When you become emotionally regulated, something profound happens in the dynamic. You stop being experienced as a source of demand and start being experienced as a source of stability. And stability, for an avoidant, is rare. In many cases, it is unfamiliar, but it is also deeply attractive because it does not trigger their defense system. Think about it this way. The avoidant is not searching for chaos. They are protecting themselves from it. And when emotional intensity enters without containment, even if it is loving, it feels like emotional flooding. But when they encounter someone who can feel deeply without collapsing into urgency, they begin to sense something different, safety without entrapment. And this is where the shift in behavior begins, because now they are no longer preparing to escape. They are no longer scanning for pressure. Instead, they are observing consistency. They are noticing that your emotional world is not dependent on their immediate response. You are not demanding instant resolution. You are not escalating uncertainty into panic. And in that space, their nervous system begins to settle. This is important to understand. Avoidants do not open up because they are convinced. They open up because they are no longer activated. Safety is not an intellectual argument. It is a physiological experience. They feel it before they understand it. So when you regulate your emotional state, you are doing something far more powerful than managing your reactions. You are changing what your presence feels like to another human nervous system. And here is where most people miss the opportunity. They assume emotional control means distance or detachment from feeling. But the truth is the opposite. The most emotionally powerful person in the room is not the one who feels the least. It is the one who can feel fully without needing to control others to stabilize that feeling. That is real strength. Because now, instead of chasing reassurance, you become grounded in self-assurance. Instead of asking, "Do you still want me?" you embody, "I am steady whether you move closer or not." And that energy is unmistakable. It does not pressure, it does not chase, it simply exists and invites. And over time, something subtle but powerful begins to shift in the avoidant. They start associating your presence with relief instead of obligation. They begin to realize they do not have to defend themselves from your emotions. They do not have to withdraw to regain control. They can simply be. And that realization is what opens the door for initiative. Because when someone no longer feels emotionally cornered, they don't just stay. They start to move toward you on their own terms. That is the paradox. The calmer you become, the more space they have to approach. The more regulated you are, the less they need to protect themselves from you. And in that safety, connection stops being something you chase and becomes something they choose. And in the end, choice is what transforms everything. One of the most misunderstood forces in human psychology is pressure, especially in relationships with avoidant individuals. Most people think clarity creates closeness. They believe that if they just define things earlier, ask the right questions, and secure commitment through conversation, they can stabilize uncertainty. But with an avoidant, pressure does not create clarity. It creates contraction. And so you have to understand what pressure actually is in emotional terms. Pressure is not just what you say. It is what the other person feels when they sense that their freedom is being evaluated, measured, or constrained. Even subtle expectations can register as pressure in their internal world. A question like, "Where is this going?" may sound innocent to one person, but to an avoidant nervous system, it can feel like a narrowing of exits. And when people feel their exits are narrowing, they don't move closer, they retreat. So the key shift here is learning to remove pressure without removing presence. Because absence of pressure does not mean absence of interest. It means you are no longer trying to force emotional timelines that the other person is not internally ready to meet. You are no longer trying to extract certainty from someone who is still forming emotional clarity within themselves. And when you do this consistently, something very interesting begins to happen in the psychological space between you. At first, the avoidant may not respond with closeness. In fact, they may even seem more distant because the system is recalibrating. They are used to managing your emotional expectations, even if they resisted them. Now that the expectation is gone, they are left alone with something they are not accustomed to sitting with, the actual emotional reality of your absence or reduced availability. And that is where the deeper shift begins. Because when pressure is removed, awareness increases. And with awareness comes something most people underestimate: emotional contrast. The avoidant begins to notice what it feels like when you are not constantly available to define the relationship, reassure the bond, or maintain momentum. And in that contrast, something begins to surface internally. They start to feel distance not as relief, but as uncertainty. And uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable in a very different way than pressure. Pressure feels external. Uncertainty feels internal, and internal discomfort is what drives reflection. So now, instead of reacting to your energy, they begin to process their own. Instead of managing your expectations, they begin to confront their own attachment signals. And that is the moment where initiative starts to become possible. But here is the critical distinction. You are not withdrawing to punish. You are not removing pressure to manipulate. You are stepping out of the role of emotional manager in the relationship. You are no longer carrying the entire burden of direction, definition, and reassurance. You are allowing the connection to exist without constant steering. And in that space, something powerful emerges. Autonomy on both sides. Because avoidants do not build connection under supervision. They build it in psychological freedom. When they feel that they are not being pulled, pushed, or evaluated, they regain access to their own internal desire. And desire is what ultimately drives initiation. Think about it. People do not pursue what feels obligatory. They pursue what feels chosen. And choice only becomes real when pressure is removed. So when you stop over-defining the relationship, stop trying to secure answers too early, and stop turning uncertainty into emotional urgency, you create something rare. A relational environment where the other person can actually hear themselves. And in that silence, they begin to notice something they were previously avoiding. Not you chasing them, but the value of your presence when it is not guaranteed. That is the turning point. Because now, their engagement is no longer a response to pressure. It becomes a response to loss, reflection, and internal desire. And that is where true initiation is born. Not when they are convinced, not when they are pressured, but when they are free enough to choose and realize they don't want to lose what they finally understand they have. There is a moment in every attachment dynamic where attraction either deepens or collapses, and it has very little to do with what you say and everything to do with how you live when you are not being validated by the other person. Because here is a truth most people resist. Availability is not the same as value. In fact, in many relational systems, excessive availability slowly erodes perceived value. Not because being kind or present is wrong, but because when your entire emotional center begins orbiting another person, the psychological signal you send is no longer attraction, it is dependence. And dependence, especially for an avoidant, does not inspire pursuit. It triggers withdrawal. So when we talk about becoming high value through independence, we are not talking about becoming distant or emotionally unavailable. We are talking about becoming structurally complete within yourself, meaning your life has direction even when the other person is silent. Your emotional stability is not outsourced to their behavior. Your identity is not waiting to be confirmed through their response. This is where the dynamic fundamentally shifts, because an avoidant is constantly scanning for one thing. Will this connection cost me my sense of self? And when they encounter someone whose life is already full, who is not waiting, not orbiting, not structurally incomplete, they experience something unexpected. The relationship stops feeling like a pull into obligation and starts feeling like an invitation into something already in motion. That distinction is everything. When your life is empty, every interaction becomes heavy. Every delay becomes anxiety. Every silence becomes meaning. And without realizing it, you begin to communicate that this connection is the center of your emotional world. But when your life is full, when your purpose is active, your direction is clear, your energy is distributed, you communicate something entirely different. This connection is a choice, not a necessity. And paradoxically, that is what makes you more emotionally compelling, because humans are drawn to momentum. We are drawn to people who are already moving, not people who are waiting to be moved. So when you shift into independence, something subtle but powerful happens in the perception of the avoidant. They no longer feel like they are being positioned as the sole source of your emotional fulfillment. They no longer feel like they are responsible for completing your internal world. And that immediately reduces psychological pressure. But something else emerges at the same time: intrigue. Because now they are no longer interacting with someone who is emotionally predictable or constantly accessible. They are interacting with someone who has a life that continues regardless of their participation. And that creates a form of respectful uncertainty, not instability, but depth. And depth is what pulls avoidance in over time. Because while they resist emotional demand, they are deeply responsive to authenticity and self-containment. They are drawn, often unconsciously, to people who do not collapse when they step back, people who remain intact, people who do not punish distance, but also do not disappear into it. That is high-value independence. And here is the critical psychological shift. When you are independent, your presence becomes a privilege rather than an expectation. Your attention is no longer assumed, it is experienced. Your engagement is no longer automatic, it is meaningful, and that changes how they relate to you internally. Instead of thinking they will always be there, they begin to think, I notice when they are not. And that difference is the beginning of emotional prioritization. Because we do not pursue what is guaranteed, we pursue what feels significant. But independence also does something deeper to you. It removes emotional bargaining. You stop negotiating your worth through proximity. You stop over-investing to secure consistency. You stop using effort as a substitute for alignment. And in that space, your energy becomes clean, not desperate, not inflated, not compensatory, clean. And clean energy is powerful because it does not demand, it attracts, it does not chase, it invites, it does not collapse when ignored, it continues to expand. And when an avoidant encounters that kind of emotional structure, something begins to rewire in their perception. You are no longer categorized as someone who needs me. You become someone I would have to meet, step into, and match. And that is where initiation begins to shift. Because now they are no longer responding to emotional pressure. They are responding to emotional presence combined with independence. And in that combination lies one of the strongest psychological magnets in human connection. Someone who wants you, but does not need you. And because of that, becomes undeniably harder to ignore. One of the most destabilizing patterns in relationships with avoidant individuals is what happens when effort becomes one-sided. Not because effort itself is wrong, but because imbalance silently rewires expectations. When one person consistently gives more attention, more emotional labor, more initiation, more reassurance, they unintentionally create a relational structure where imbalance feels normal. And once imbalance becomes normal, it stops being questioned. It becomes the baseline. So the question is not whether you should care. The question is whether your care is creating a dynamic where the other person no longer feels the need to step forward. Because psychologically, human beings adapt quickly to emotional patterns. If someone consistently receives 80% of the emotional investment while giving 20%, they rarely feel pressure to increase their contribution. Not because they are malicious, but because the system is already working for them. And this is where mirroring becomes one of the most powerful corrective principles in relational psychology. Mirroring is not withdrawal. It is not manipulation. It is alignment. It is the act of matching energy instead of compensating for imbalance. If they initiate, you respond with presence. If they invest lightly, you do not escalate into overinvestment. You meet energy with energy, not excess, not deficiency. And this matters deeply in avoidant dynamics because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional asymmetry, even if they do not consciously articulate it. When someone consistently overgives, the avoidant does not interpret it as stability. They often interpret it as expectation waiting to happen. And expectation, even unspoken, creates internal pressure. But when you mirror effort, something different begins to develop. The relational field becomes balanced, predictable in structure but not suffocating in intensity. There is no emotional debt being accumulated on either side. There is simply exchange, and exchange is psychologically safe. Now here is where the deeper transformation occurs. When you stop overcompensating, you force the system to reveal reality. If someone is genuinely interested, they will naturally begin to match your level of engagement. If they are passive, inconsistent, or avoidant of emotional responsibility, that pattern becomes visible without you having to force clarity through confrontation. Mirroring, in this sense, is truth revealing. But more importantly, it restores self-respect into the relational equation. Because overcompensation often comes from a subconscious belief. If I give more, I can stabilize this connection. But in reality, giving more rarely creates stability. It creates dependency on your effort while decreasing the other person's incentive to grow into the connection. And that is how imbalance quietly deepens over time. So when you begin to mirror instead of overextend, you send a new signal into the dynamic. Connection must be mutual to continue expanding. Not in a punitive way, but in a structural way. You are no longer willing to carry the emotional architecture alone. And this is where avoidants begin to shift. Because when they encounter consistent, calm mirroring, not emotional overreach, not withdrawal games, but steady proportional response, they begin to learn something new about the relationship. They learn that connection here is not forced, but it is also not endlessly available without contribution. And that realization activates something important: responsibility. For many avoidants, responsibility in relationships has historically been associated with pressure. But mirroring redefines it. It shows them that engagement is not about being trapped. It is about participating in something that remains stable only when both sides show up. And over time, something subtle begins to change in their behavior. They start testing effort. They start initiating more to see if it is met. They start gauging whether their investment produces connection rather than obligation. And when it does, a new association forms in their mind. Initiating does not lead to pressure. It leads to reward, consistency, and emotional reciprocity. That is the beginning of behavioral rewiring. But perhaps the most important effect of mirroring is what it does to you. It removes the unconscious habit of emotional overextension. It pulls you out of the role of pursuer and places you back into the role of equal participant. It restores dignity to your emotional investment, because love that is constantly overgiven stops being love expressed. It becomes love negotiated, and you are no longer negotiating. You are reflecting. And in that reflection, something powerful emerges. A relationship where effort is no longer extracted, but exchanged. Where initiation is no longer demanded, but naturally balanced. Where both people begin to meet each other not out of obligation, but out of genuine willingness. And that is the moment everything begins to change. Because the moment effort becomes mutual, initiation becomes inevitable. At the deepest level of every avoidant dynamic, there comes a point where strategy stops working and truth begins. And the truth is this: no amount of effort, adjustment, or emotional intelligence can replace the energy of detachment rooted in self-respect. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. People hear the word and think it means indifference, emotional coldness, or withdrawal from care. But real detachment has nothing to do with emotional absence. It has everything to do with internal freedom. It is the state where your emotional well-being is no longer contingent on someone else's participation. And that is the moment everything in the dynamic shifts. Because when you are attached in an anxious way, your behavior becomes outcome dependent. You reach out not because it aligns with your values, but because silence feels unbearable. You overanalyze, overexpress, overinvest, not from clarity, but from urgency. And that urgency is felt even when unspoken. But when you are detached, something very different happens. You still care, but you are no longer negotiating your self-worth through the relationship's response. You are no longer performing emotional labor to secure reassurance. You are no longer using closeness as a way to stabilize internal uncertainty. Instead, you are anchored, and that anchoring changes everything about how you are perceived. Because an avoidant individual is highly attuned, not always consciously, but instinctively, to emotional need. They detect pursuit energy even when it is subtle. They feel when someone is trying to pull a response out of them. And when that energy is present, even love can feel like pressure. But detachment removes that pressure completely. Now, your presence is no longer asking for something from them. It is no longer leaning forward emotionally. It is simply there, stable, whole, self-contained. And that creates a very different psychological experience for the other person. Instead of feeling pursued, they begin to feel space. Instead of feeling responsible for your emotional equilibrium, they begin to sense your internal stability. And that stability is not just calming, it is intriguing. Because psychologically, humans are drawn to what is not trying to control them. And here is the paradox most people miss. Detachment does not reduce connection. It actually increases emotional clarity. When you stop over-engaging, over-explaining, and over-investing in uncertain dynamics, you allow the relationship to show its true structure. You are no longer distorting reality through effort. You are observing it. And what becomes visible is whether the connection has intrinsic desire on both sides, or whether it has been sustained primarily through your emotional input. This is where avoidants begin to shift in a different way. Because when they encounter someone who is no longer chasing, no longer escalating emotional urgency, no longer trying to fix distance, they are left alone with the actual presence of the connection. And in that presence, something subtle begins to surface. Awareness. They begin to notice your absence differently. Not as relief, not as pressure, but as something undefined that they did not fully register when you were over-functioning in the dynamic. And that undefined feeling is what creates internal movement. Because detachment removes the external push and what remains is internal reflection. They are no longer reacting to your emotional intensity. They are now processing their own sense of connection, distance, and loss of access. And in many cases, that is the first time genuine initiation becomes psychologically possible. But detachment also transforms you in a far more important way. It removes you from the cycle of emotional overinvestment that leads to depletion. It breaks the pattern of proving, chasing, and compensating. It returns you to yourself, not as a reaction to someone else's distance, but as a commitment to your own stability. And from that place, your decisions become cleaner. Your boundaries become clearer. Your presence becomes intentional rather than reactive. You no longer engage to secure. You engage to connect. And that difference is everything. Because when you are detached, you are no longer trying to convince someone to meet you. You're simply allowing reality to reveal who is willing to. And the moment that shift happens, the entire relational dynamic changes. You are no longer the one chasing clarity. You become the one who embodies it. You are no longer waiting for initiation. You become the standard by which initiation is measured. And in that state, something powerful becomes undeniable. The more you release the need to hold on, the more space you create for something real to finally move towards you. Because what is meant to initiate never responds to pressure, it responds to freedom. And when you are truly free inside yourself, you no longer need them to come closer, but paradoxically, that is exactly when they finally do. And so when you step back and see the full picture, you realize something most people never learn in relationships like this. It was never about forcing an avoidant to change. It was about changing the emotional environment you were bringing into the connection.